Time for another board game review, and this time we have the game A Game of Thrones, the board game, 2nd edition. This was sent to me by Asmodee and is designed by Christian T. Peterson. A Game of Thrones, the board game, is a game for 3 to 6 players based on George R.R. Martin's best-selling A Song of Ice and Fire novels. In A Game of Thrones, the board game, players each control one of 6 great houses seeking dominance over the lands of Westeros. By mustering armies, conquering territory, and forming alliances, each house strives to control the most castles and strongholds, so it may ultimately claim the Iron Throne. Let me show you how to play. The Game of Thrones, the board game, is played over 10 game rounds, each consisting of the following 3 phases. First, you have the Westeros Phase, which you skip in game round 1. You draw the top card of each Westeros deck, and resolve them in order. These represent important game procedures and events. So, for example, here's a Throne of Blades. The holder of the Iron Throne token chooses whether everyone updates their supply and then reconciles armies. Everyone musters units. You know what any of this means yet, so it doesn't really matter. But anyway, you draw a card for each and shit happens. Clash of Kings, bid on 3 influence checks. You don't know what that is yet. And Sea of Storms raid orders cannot be played during this planning phase. So yeah, the first round you would not draw these, but every subsequent round you would draw 3 events, and shit happens. Next is the planning phase, where each player simultaneously assigns face-down order tokens to each area containing one or more of his units. As you can see throughout the board, there are units everywhere. And then the action phase, the order tokens you assigned during the planning phase are now resolved. And the majority of the activity is during this phase. After each action phase, you do a new round, starting with another Westeros phase. If at any time during the game a player controls 7 areas containing a castle or stronghold, the game is over and that player is the winner. Otherwise, the game lasts until the end of the 10th game round, at which point the player who controls the most areas containing a castle or stronghold wins the game. So yeah, like I said, the Westeros phase, you would advance the round marker 1 position and then look at the Wildlings cards and do them. And on here you can see there's a Wildlings icon. You count the number of Wildling icons on these cards and move the Wildling threat token forward that many spaces on the track. So as you can see right now, this token is on 2. With this, you would move it forward 2 spaces. If it ever reaches 12, you do a Wildling Attack, and this does some fun stuff. That'll all be explained later. So in a full game, there are 6 different houses. Each has different starting positions, army layouts, positions on the tracks, and so on. And these little hidden screens tell you everything you need to know. Like here's House Tyrell's info. And yeah, it tells you everything you need to know for setup. If the supply card is resolved, it says adjust supply track and reconcile armies. You would have to count the number of supply icons printed in areas you control and then move your supply token on the supply track over here. So to adjust the supply, each house would look at how many of these supply icons are in areas that they control. So House Baratheon here controls 1, 2. That means he would adjust his supply on this track. Now, they're already set the way they were, but let's say House Baratheon controlled, I don't know, 1 more over here. Now that would be 4 barrels, so he would move up on the track. These numbers here on these flags illustrate the number of different armies and the maximum number of units each army can have on the game board. So if you have a supply of 4, then House Baratheon here can have 2 armies of 3, meaning 2 groups of 3 units on the board, as well as 2 groups of 2 units. A single unit doesn't count as an army, but right now this would be an army of 2. And so you would have that limit based on your supplies. If you ever adjust supply and have too many units, like let's say for example House Baratheon had 2-3 armies but moved down to barrel 3 after adjusting, then they would have to remove units from the board. Now possession of these barrel icons can change throughout the game, but the supply track only gets updated when that specific Westeros card gets pulled. Otherwise, you stay at your supply level until that card comes out. Another Westeros card that can be pulled is Mustering. Mustering is how you call your units into action. You can recruit new units into each area you control that contains a castle or stronghold, and each of them provides mustering points, which may be spent to recruit new units in the area. So let's look at House Stark. House Stark currently controls 1 stronghold, which gives you 2 points of mustering, and 1 castle, which gives you 1 point of mustering. Footmen cost 1 point of mustering. Knights cost 2 points of mustering, or 1 point of upgraded from a footman. Ships cost 1 point of mustering. And siege engines cost 2 points of mustering, or 1 point of upgraded from a footman. So let's say House Stark decides to use 2 mustering points to put a knight in here. And as an option, they can also upgrade footmen instead. So this gives you 1 mustering point, so he could upgrade this footman to a knight. It always goes in the area that gave you the mustering points. Ships, like other units, are mustered by an area containing a castle or stronghold, but they may be placed in a port connected to the mustering area or in an adjacent sea area. But they cannot be mustered into a sea area that contains 1 or more enemy ships. And finally, one more important card that can be pulled is Clash of Kings, which lets you bid on the 3 influence tracks. Let's go over what those are. There are 3 influence tracks: the Iron Throne, Fiefdoms, and the King's Court, and your initial rankings are decided at the beginning of the game. But when Clash of Kings gets pulled, that's when you can bid to try to change your positions on these tracks. You use your power tokens. Each player starts with 5 of them, and you enclose them in a fist as a bid. You would bid for each track in order. So let's say for the first track, I bid as House Baratheon 2 power tokens for Iron Throne. You would then see how many tokens each person bid, and whoever wins, you change the track accordingly. Whoever has the highest bid gets to be first. Let's say House Martell was first, then they would become position 1. And then let's say Lannister was the second highest, they would be number 2. And if there are any ties, let's say these 4 all bid the same amount, whoever has the Iron Throne token at the time gets to decide the order of the tiebreaker. In the beginning of the game, Baratheon starts with this. So Baratheon would be like, okay, I'll be first, and I don't like you, Stark. I'm gonna go put you here. And maybe he's like, Tyrell, you know what? I like you. I'll put you on 4. The Iron Throne holder can decide that. Whatever power tokens you bid are discarded, even if you didn't win. You do the same thing for each track, and then once all the positions are decided, you give the appropriate tokens to the appropriate players. But let's talk about what makes these tracks so important. First off, the Iron Throne track. This decides turn order. But what's cool about being first place is if you have the Iron Throne, you get to decide the result of all ties in the game, except combat. You can be like, all right, if I'm tied with you, I win. Or if 2 houses are tied, you can be like, which one of you is gonna like help me out? I'll let you win the tie. It's definitely a really juicy position of power. The Fiefdoms track is how you break ties in combat. If you're higher on the track than someone else and you have a tie in combat, then you win. The Valyrian Steel Blade token, which number 1 has, lets you have a +1 in combat. And finally, the King's Court track. This determines the number of special order tokens you have available during the planning phase. The higher your position, the greater number of special order tokens available. There are 3 available to this house, 2 to this one, and so on. I'll explain orders and special orders later. If you're first place on this track, you get the Messenger Raven. And what that lets you do is you can do one of the following actions after the reveal orders step of the planning phase. You can swap one of your order tokens on the board for one of your unused ones. If you're like, oh, I see how everyone's going, I'm going to swap mine out because I don't want to do that anymore. Or you can look at the top of the Wildling deck. After looking, you can choose to return it to the top or place it at the bottom of the deck. So yeah, after the Westeros phase and you resolve all those cards and do a Wildling Attack if you need to, then it's time to put orders on the board. First you assign orders, then you reveal orders, and then if someone has a Messenger Raven, they're allowed to use it. So for assigning orders, each player must place exactly 1 order token face down on each area he controls that contains at least 1 of his units. So for House Tyrell here, they'd have to put 3 order tokens down. All players place their orders simultaneously. An area cannot be assigned more than 1 token. Now, you can never reveal your orders to other players. You can plead, you can suggest strategies, you can do whatever you want to advise people to see what they'll do. There are 5 different types of tokens. I'll go over these later, but we have March tokens, Defense tokens, Support tokens, Raid orders, and Consolidate Power orders. There are also special versions of these orders, but you can only use these if you're high enough on the King's Court track, like I said earlier. So each player would put down tokens face down. Once everyone's put their tokens on the board, then everyone flips them all over simultaneously, and then you resolve them in the action phase. But the person with the Messenger Raven can be like, let's say for example, House Lannister, who has the Messenger Raven, is like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore because of so-and-so's thing. They can swap and put a different token down. Or they can look at the Wildling card like I mentioned. So first off, let's go over raid orders. Let's look at this, and let's say House Lannister did this and House Baratheon did this. Now what a raid order token can do is choose one enemy support, raid, or consolidate power order adjacent to that order, and simply remove it. Basically, you're like, nope, you don't get to do that. Now in this case, the power was used to remove a Consolidate Power order token. In that case, it's called pillaging. After you resolve the order, whoever pillaged receives one power token added to their pool, and the affected player loses one power token. If there were no eligible adjacent tokens, the raid order doesn't do anything. You can also choose not to do it, even if you have the opportunity to. If you're like, oh, okay, I'll be nice to you and not do it. Yeah, so first off, everyone resolves all of their raid order tokens in turn order. Then you would move on to march orders, which I'll show you next. This is how you move your units. You can move all, some, or none of your units from the area assigned the march order. You can separate them into several adjacent areas. For each march order, you can only move units into one enemy area. So if I had, like, let's say 2 adjacent enemy areas, I can only move one of my units, or I can only move one time into an enemy adjacent area. If you ever go into an area where there are enemy tokens, then combat starts. So see, there's another march token. Let's say it goes back to Lannister's turn. They could move their units into here, and then it's time for a fight. Before you resolve combat, all other non-combat movement from the area assigned order must be completed. The number on this token signifies the combat strength modifier. In this case, it's just 0, so nothing happens. If you leave an area behind, you lose control of that area unless you establish control by putting a power token in that area. I'll go over defense and support orders a little bit later when I get into combat. Let's go to Consolidate Power now. Let's see House Martell reveals a Consolidate Power token. For this, it's simply you get one token, power token from the pool, as well as one additional token for each power icon in the area. So in this case, they would get 2 power, which is useful for bidding and laying down on land. After you resolve your raiding, your moving, and your consolidating, then you clean up and remove all tokens from the board. Any routed units are stood up to their upright position. We'll go over that later. And that's the action phase. Then you just go back to the next round and start flipping those Westeros cards again, and keep going until the game is over. The game ends if you reach the end of the 10th round, or if somebody controls 7 areas containing a castle or stronghold. So these areas are very critical, and you track how far people are on this victory track here. If you ever take your 7th castle or stronghold, you immediately win. If you get to the end of the game of 10 game rounds, whoever has the highest position on the victory track wins the game. If they're tied, whoever has the greatest number of strongholds, there's a bunch of tiebreakers, blah, 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 blah. But you'll probably win by taking the 7 castles. Now let's go into combat. If you march your units into an area with other houses' units, combat ensues. It's all resolved by comparing combat strength. Different elements can contribute to combat strength. Units in the combat, supporting units, defense orders, march orders, the Valyrian Steelblade token, house cards, and so on. Each footman is 1 combat strength. Each knight is 2 combat strength. If you're doing a ship battle, each one is 1 strength. And then if you have a siege engine, it adds 4 combat strength when attacking. Otherwise, it's 0 strength. Whoever's resolving the march order is the attacker, and whoever is occupying is the defender. First off, what you do is you see if anyone with a support token wants to add their power to the fight. Let's say that House Tyrell here had a support order type icon. House Tyrell has 3 combat strength, and they could be like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna help House Baratheon. That means House Baratheon would have 3 additional power, so it'd be 4 so far against 2. If you support a conflict, you don't remove this token. This could actually support multiple conflicts as long as they're adjacent to this token. You can also garner support from your own men. So let's say House Lannister had some men here, and there was a support token, then he could add 2 tokens to his power. You don't actually move them, but you add that power to them. So in this case, it'd be a tie game so far. If House Lannister had used this move order token, then they'd have -1 combat, but since they use the +0, nothing happens here. Then it's time to play house cards. Each house has 7 different unique combat cards. You would put them face down and reveal them simultaneously. So that's how they play these cards, and they reveal. Now, this tells you how much combat strength they add. They actually both add 4 combat strength, so they're still tied, so now we gotta read the effects. Tywin Lannister, if you win this combat, gain 2 power tokens. But Stannis Baratheon, if your opponent has a higher position on the Iron Throne influence track than you, this card gains +1 combat strength. And as you can see over there, the Lannisters are higher than Baratheons, meaning that the Baratheons would get a +1 combat and they would win this combat round. Whenever you resolve a combat, whatever card you play gets discarded into a discard pile, and then when you use your last card, you return the other 6 cards into your hand, and the last played card returns or stays in the discard pile. Some of the cards have sword icons, so if you win the combat, and you have 3 swords on here, your opponent has to destroy 3 units from that area if you won. Castles can block swords and prevent your cards or units from being destroyed. All house cards are public knowledge, so you'll always know what cards your opponent has available to them, but you won't know what they play. Now, neither house had the Valyrian Steel Blade, but if they did, they could have used it to add +1 combat strength. So we determined the victor. In this case, it's House Baratheon. There were no swords played, so no units actually get destroyed. But if there were, if the victor had if he had played sword icons, then Lannister would have to destroy some of his units. If the attacker loses, they got to retreat back to where they came from. If the defender lost, then they'd have to retreat to one empty adjacent area or to a friendly area, so they could go, you know, like here or something. And if Baratheon had to retreat, then the units become routed. They're put on their side, and they don't provide any more combat strength. If these are forced to retreat, they are destroyed. And then once combat is done, you remove that token from the board. And then finally, defense orders. If Baratheon had played a +2 defense here, then that would just add to their combat strength. And by the way, this is a special order, and like as you can see, they do special things like either do bigger boosts on things. Special raid tokens can remove any one adjacent defense order, which is, you know, a little bit stronger. And the special Consolidate Power, instead of using it to get power, you could actually use it to muster and get units. But you have to have a castle or stronghold on the country that you place this token on. Now, going back to the Wildling cards, if you ever have to do a Wildling Attack, this is where all the countries or houses can work together. You resolve a Wildling Attack if this reaches 12, or if you have to withdraw a Wildling Attack Westeros card. So let's look at an example. Here's some Mammoth Riders attacking. What happens is each player is going to bid a certain number of power behind their screen, and then put it in a closed fist. And then what you do is you reveal and show how much power you have total. And you'll see if you can defeat the Wildlings or not. In this case, the Wildling strength is 12. So let's say everyone bid enough to defeat them, 12 or more power. Then you can do a Night's Watch victory. The highest bidder may retrieve 1 house card of his choice from his house card discard pile. It gives you a little benefit if you were the most generous bidder. But if the Wildlings won, whoever did the lowest bid has to destroy 3 of his units anywhere, and everyone else destroys 2 of their units. So the punishments for Wildling victories can be pretty brutal, which is why it could be to your benefit to chip in with power if this happens, because it fucks everybody over. If the Night's Watch was victorious, you put this back to 0, but if the Wildlings won, you just move it 2 back. And then you discard all the power that was bid. Now let's go over ship transport. As you can see, there are ships here, and any 2 land areas that have friendly ships connected are considered adjacent. So since ships here connect all the way up to here, you could actually move up there in one move order if you wanted. If you decide to leave an area with units, you can choose to put one of your power tokens there to establish control. This means you still get to use like any supply or castle tokens on there. But if an opponent goes on there, they get to take it. Each house does have a home area, as you can see by the shield indicated here. You always control this, even if you don't put a power token here. Now, players are always free at any time and any phase to make promises and seek alliances with other houses. But they're never binding, and it can be broken for any reason. So this is a very backstabby game. There are 3 strict rules. You can never show other players any assigned order token. You can never give items away. And bids must always be in secret. You can never show anyone else how much you're bidding for something. Now, I haven't gone through every single thing in the game. Like, for example, there are like ports you can like muster units to. There are like neutral force tokens, like depending on how many players you're playing with, where you have to fight them. Garrisons that give you extra powers. But the gist of the game is that You're placing those orders secretly and revealing them and fighting each other, taking land, getting more supply barrels or more power or more of these castles. You can muster more units. In the meantime, different events happen in the Westeros phase and so on. And you're just trying to get all 7 castles, or at least the most castles by the end of the game, while also making temporary alliances and backstabbing each other. And that's the game. So this game is intense. I knew from its reputation that it would be long and it would be vicious. And there are things that I enjoy about it and don't personally enjoy about it. Overall, I think I enjoyed half of the experience. First off, one issue I have with the game is it does not scale well with different player accounts. The ideal way to play is have all 6 houses. But if you play with less, you have to use these dummy neutral forces that make the playing field pretty unbalanced, because it's way easier to fight a static number, because when you're fighting a neutral force, you don't have to worry about cards or anything. You just have to beat a number. It's much harder to fight an actual human being with a brain and a deck of cards than just a static number that you can just take land. Another thing I'm not super fond of is that some of the houses I feel are definitely weaker than the others. This doesn't feel like a game where it's like everyone has different powers, but you're relatively balanced. The house you pick potentially has a significant benefit or tactical disadvantage from the moment you begin. And because of that, if you play with people who like make bizarre moves or just mess up, not only can those players get totally destroyed, but they also give a huge advantage to players who gobble up their lands. So it's like, if you're playing with someone who like maybe is playing for the first time versus someone who like has played like lots of tactical games, they can totally get their shit fucked, and then that player gets so much more benefit. So here's where I come to my main point. It's a well-designed game. I think it's a fantastic design, but there's so much potential for the balance to totally collapse. Unless you're playing with 6 people who are just experts at the game, there's potential for elimination from the game, and I do not like player elimination in games, especially a game as long as this. This can take hours and hours and hours to play, and being like eliminated from that totally sucks, I think. My favorite part of the game is the pure negotiation of the first half. Like, I had so much fun making deals with other players, like, alright, if you don't attack me, I won't attack you, and let's try to attack them, and maybe I'll support you there. Oh, but I didn't support you. I said I was going to support you, and I didn't. It really feels thematic, like you're actually, like, making deals in Westeros or whatever. It's only going to feel as thematic, though, as what the players bring to the table. Like, you don't want to play this game purely for just area control or combat. You play it because you want to be a fucker. You want to backstab your friends. You want to be a maniacal little bitch. For the first half of the game, it feels like that. You're just making deals and sneaking around. Putting down the secret orders is fun, and it makes you think about what you have to do and what your neighbors are going to do. Like, okay, they're putting what are they going to put there? If they're going to put a move icon there, then maybe I should put a defense icon here. But one thing that really sucks is not being able to do special actions without stars from the King's Court track. Because the different houses have a set order on the tracks at the beginning of the game. So no matter what, some players just from the beginning can't use special orders. And you can only change those tracks if Clash of Kings gets pulled from the Westeros decks. So if it doesn't get pulled, and you're just stuck not being able to use your special powers, it blows. The special Consolidate Power is the only way you can muster new units unless a supply card shows up. So if that card doesn't show up and you don't have special powers, you can't muster, and you just find yourself going, cool, I can't, everyone else can bring new units, and I can't. Because of that, I really don't like that certain mechanics, like mustering new units or changing your position on the influence tracks, are activated by random cards drawn from the Westeros decks. I really don't like that. Sometimes you can go for ages without being able to get any new guys, or you're just stuck in a shitty position on the track, because that's what it was said at the beginning of the game. I really think the game should have these actions happen at set moments in the game instead of being determined by random draw. Or maybe like every 2 turns, or I don't know, or set turns of the game, I don't know. I feel like, because there was like a game where it was just, no one could get units forever. And it just kind of sucked. As far as the game's length, I think it's a little too long for my taste. And I think that for me, the game gets less interesting as it progresses. The first half was so much fun for me. I loved all the dealing and wheeling and all of that. Because there's so much you can bargain over in the beginning. There's all this empty land, and everyone's deciding where they're going to go, who they're going to fight.
So you can really influence how the game proceeds in that first half. But then in the second half of the game, everyone pretty much knows what they're going to do. They've gotten their specific lands that they wanted, and they know exactly what they have to do next to win. Yeah, you can still negotiate, but at the end of the day, it's pretty obvious what you have to do if you want to win. If someone's in the lead and they're close to winning 7 castles, you have to attack them, or else they will win. If a castle is undefended, you should take it, because it's already close to the end of the game. You need that extra castle. And so it just kind of boils down to, okay, grab castles, get that castle, I'll get that castle, that castle. And all the intrigue from before that made the game so electrifying just kind of evaporates and becomes a pretty standard, okay, area control war game. Cool, get that and get that and get that. It drags on too much in that part of the game for me. It's not as interesting, and it's kind of boring. Also, sometimes random cards get pulled, like suddenly this round, no one can defend and no one can support. And your strategy you were maybe setting up for combat can just be fucked in a turn because of a random Westeros card. Now, after all of this, if you're the type of person who loves this kind of game, you already know. When you watched me explain the game, you knew, oh, that's my shit. And I respect that. I think the game is very well designed, overall. It's a very good game. It's a little too fiddly for my taste in some of the rules, but putting down the secret tactics and fighting and making deals and taking land is fun. I don't like the randomness of the card decks very much, just because some specific things like supplying and mustering are so dependent on that, and sometimes it's just like, okay, I can't get more guys because it's not, the card's not being drawn. So with my personal experience, first half, a blast. Second half, especially the last third of the game, I was fatigued. I became just like a okay area control game, when before it was this intense, exciting, secret deal negotiation game, and it kind of became tedium at the end. Kind of like the show, am I right? But